What would you do if a hungry runaway knocked on a stranger's door? What if kindness put you in the path of men with guns? And what if the only people strong enough to fix it were the last men society trusts? Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The night air was cold and empty when 14-year-old Milo Crest walked down the cracked sidewalk with shaking legs and a hollow stomach. His shoes torn, his hoodie thin, his eyes always moving because kids who lived on the street learned fast that danger liked dark corners. And when the porch light clicked on at the small wooden house at the end of Maple Street, he almost ran until he heard the old voice call out gentle and slow, asking if he was hungry, and Milo froze because no one asked. That without wanting something back, but the man looked harmless, gray hair, thin arms, soft eyes, and his name was Arthur Dane, a widower who lived alone and hated silence more than strangers. So he opened the door wider and said he had soup and bread and no questions if the boy wanted it. And hunger beat fear the way it always did, so Milo stepped inside and smelled warm for the first time in weeks. His shoulders dropped while he ate fast at the kitchen table, like someone might steal it. And Arthur just watched with quiet kindness like feeding a stray dog, who finally trusted a hand. And neither of them heard the tires outside or saw the shadow past the curtain until the back door exploded inward, and two masked men rushed in shouting and waving guns because they thought the old man kept cash in the house from his late wife's insurance. And fear hit the room like thunder. Milo stood up fast, knocking his chair over. Arthur raised his hand, shaking. The robbers yelled for money, and one grabbed Milo by the collar, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle his teeth. And something inside the boy snapped, because he had been hit before, and he knew that look in violent men's eyes. So he kicked wildly and bit the man's wrist, and the gun fired into the ceiling with a deaf crack that filled the house with dust and ringing ears. The second robber cursed and swung his pistol, striking Milo across the head, and the boy dropped, blood running, warmed down his temple, while Arthur shouted for them to stop and try to shield him. But the first robber panicked now that the shot was fired and slammed Arthur down too. And for a second the world went slow and quiet except for Milo's fading hearing and Arthur's weak groan, and the robbers grabbed what little they could and ran because sirens were already starting far away. And the last thing Milo saw before blackness took him was Arthur's trembling hand reaching toward him across the floor like a promise that someone still cared, whether he woke up or not. And when morning came, sunlight fell across white hospital sheets where machines beeped steady and calm, and the boy's head was wrapped in bandages while the old man slept in the next bed, breathing through an oxygen tube. And down the hall, heavy boots echoed because Rourke Callan walked like the ground owed him space. Broad shoulders under a worn leather vest, beard lined with gray, eyes sharp like a man who had seen too many bad endings, and beside him walked his 10-year-old daughter Lila, holding his finger, her routine checkup bracelet bright pink against his scarred hand. And nurses watched him pass because men like Rourke carried storms around them even when silent. He was the president of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club, a brotherhood that lived by rules older than most laws, and he hated hospitals but loved his kid more than pride. So he came every month and stood guard like nothing in the world could touch her. And while waiting for her doctor, he noticed the room with two patients who didn't look like they belonged together, one old, one young, both bruised, both alone, and something about that picture pressed on a memory he didn't like. A memory of being a scared boy himself long before leather and engines and loyalty became his armor. So he told Lila to stay with the nurse and stepped to the desk asking in a low voice what happened to them. And the doctor hesitated because men built like Rourke usually asked questions for reasons people regretted. But the truth came out simple. Home invasion. Kid fought back. Both hurt bad. no family listed, and Rourke nodded slow while a quiet heat spread in his chest. Not anger yet, just that heavy feeling that comes before it. And he walked to the doorway and looked in at the boy's bruised face and the old man's frail body, and he felt something shift inside him like a lock turning, because he knew violence, he knew cowards who hunted the weak, and he knew one rule his club never broke: nobody hurts the helpless, and walks away, breathing easy. And Milo's eyes opened just then, groggy and confused, and he saw the giant biker silhouette in the doorway, and flinched until Rourke spoke softer than anyone expected, telling him he was safe now and asking his name. And the boy whispered it unsure, and Rourke nodded once, like he had just accepted a mission he didn't plan but wouldn't refuse. And in that quiet hospital room with sunlight on the floor and machines humming steady, the first spark of something dangerous was born. Not chaos, not revenge, but promise. The kind of promise a scarred man makes when he sees pain he recognizes, the kind that changes lives and starts wars all at once. Rourke did not speak much on the ride back to the clubhouse that afternoon, the highway stretching long and empty while wind pushed against his vest and the engine growled under him like a chained animal. And behind him rode the rest of the Iron Sentinels in tight formation, because when their president rode silent, it meant something serious was turning in his head, and the men who knew him best could read his moods the way sailors read storm clouds. So no one joked, no one raced, no one broke rank. And when they reached the old brick warehouse they called home, the garage door rattled open and the smell of oil and metal wrapped around them like familiar armor. And inside waited the men who were more family than blood, each one carrying a role that kept the club alive in ways outsiders never understood. There was Boone Haver, the strategist with sharp eyes and a habit of seeing trouble before it arrived. Dex Rayner, the enforcer, built like a wall and quiet as stone until violence spoke his language. Cruz Velen, the medic who could stitch a wound with steadier hands than most surgeons, and Lalpritch, the lookout who missed nothing and trusted no one. And they all watched Rourke step off his bike slowly like a man, carrying news heavier than steel. And he did not waste time, because leaders like him believed truth should walk straight, not wander. So he told them about the boy and the old man and the break-in and the fear he saw in that hospital room. And while he spoke, the room stayed still except for the ticking of the cooling engines. And when he finished, Dex crossed his arms and asked one question in his deep gravel voice, saying who did it. And Rourke said he did not know yet, but he would. And Boone leaned forward against the table, saying home invasions like were not random anymore, not these days, not in this county, because a new crew had been pushing into neighborhoods, hitting houses they thought were easy, elderly, alone, quiet streets. And Lal nodded, confirming he had heard the same whispers from gas stations and back lots where rumors traveled faster than radios. And Cruz asked about the kid's injuries, and Rourke said he would heal, but the look in his eyes said something else was broken deeper, something older than last night. And silence settled again, because every man there had once been that kind of boy, hurt young and forced to grow teeth early. And loyalty moved through the room without needing words, the same way it always did when the club faced a choice between minding its business or defending someone who could not defend themselves. And Boone finally said they needed facts, not guesses. And Rourke nodded, because that was why Boone was a strategist and not just another writer. So he told Lyle to start listening on the street channels and Dex to check pawn shops and back alley sellers for anyone moving cheap stolen goods from a small house job. And Cruz asked if they were stepping in official or unofficial, and that question mattered because official meant the whole club stood behind it, and unofficial meant Rourke carried it alone. And Rourke looked at each of them slow before answering that no one hunts prey in their town without the Sentinels knowing. And that was all he said, but it was enough because the air shifted from concern to purpose. And Dex gave a small grin like a wolf scenting tracks while Boone already reached for his notebook, mapping routes and possibilities. And for a few minutes, the room, filled with quiet planning voices and the scratch of pen on paper and the soft clink of tools being set aside. And then the door opened and a young prospect hurried in, pale and tense, saying he had something they needed to hear. And everyone turned because prospects did not interrupt counsel unless it mattered. And the kid swallowed hard and said a name that made Boone's pen stop and Dex's jaw tighten. The name was Calder Voss, a man who was not loud or flashy, but who had built a quiet empire, running theft crews and pressure rackets across 3 counties, a man known for never shouting and never forgiving, the kind of criminal who smiled while ruining lives. And Law muttered that if Voss's people hit that house, then it was no accident, because Voss did nothing random. He chose targets like a hunter choosing which animal would not fight back. And Rourke felt that slow heat in his chest grow hotter, because he knew men like that. Men who treated fear like currency, and he asked how. Sure the source was, and the prospect said very sure, because his cousin ran with one of Voss's drivers and heard them bragging about scaring an old man so bad he hit the floor before they even touched him. And Dex's hands curled slowly in a fist, but he stayed quiet waiting for Rourke because that was the rule. The president spoke last. And Rourke walked to the table and rested both palms on it, looking down at the scratched while memories moved behind his eyes. Memories of nights when no one came to help him, memories of doors that stayed closed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried iron inside it. And he said no predators are going to make a hunting ground out of his streets. And Boone warned that going against Voss meant stepping into a deeper fight, because Voss paid off people who wore badges and people who wore suits. And Cruz added that fights like that never stayed small. And Rourke nodded because he knew the cost already. But then he said something that settled it for everyone. He said that boy looked at him like he was the last wall left in the world. And no one in the Iron Sentinels ever let a wall fall when someone leaned on it. And that was the moment the choice locked into place, not shouted, not voted, just understood. And Lyle exhaled slow, saying he would start watching Voss's routes tonight. And Boone began outlining safe approaches and fallback plans. And Dex cracked his knuckles once like thunder far away and outside the sun, dipped low, painting the garage door red like a warning sign. And as shadows stretched across the concrete floor, Rourke felt that old familiar feeling settle over him. The feeling that comes right before roads turn dangerous and lines get crossed. And somewhere across town, Calder Voss did not yet know that he had touched something he should have left alone. But the storm was already rolling toward him, steady and unstoppable. And every man in that room could feel it coming. Night settled heavy over the city, as if the sky itself knew something bad was about to happen. And inside the Iron Sentinel's garage, the lights were low, and the air smelled like fuel and tension, while Rourke stood over Boone's spread maps, listening to every detail twice, because men who survived long learned that mistakes were usually born from rushing. And Boone traced a route with his finger, explaining that Calder Voss's runners used an abandoned freight yard as a handoff point for stolen goods before shipment. And Lyle confirmed he had watched the place from a rooftop across the street and counted guards, vehicles, patterns, and blind spots, his voice quiet and exact like a camera recording facts. And Dex leaned against a steel pillar, cracking his neck slowly, because waiting always made him restless. And Cruz sat nearby, packing a medical kit with calm hands, knowing plans like this often ended in blood, no matter how careful they were. And Rourke listened to all of it without blinking, his mind fitting the pieces together, while Milo's bruised face kept rising in his thoughts like a reminder of why this mattered. And finally, he asked the only question that counted, which was whether the yard was Voss's main nest or just a branch. And Boone answered that it was not the head, but it was close enough to smell it. a place where trusted men worked, which meant if the Sentinels pressed there hard enough, someone important would feel it. And silence followed, because that meant. Tonight would not be a warning, it would be a message. And Rourke straightened and said they would move fast and clean with no noise they didn't choose. And every man nodded once, because that was the difference between them and street punks. They did not chase chaos, they controlled it. And within minutes, engines roared alive and the bikes rolled out into the dark one by one like shadows with headlights. The highway stretching ahead, empty and black, while wind whipped their jackets and the city. Lights faded behind them, and during the ride, Rourke's thoughts drifted back to the hospital room where Arthur slept weak but alive, and Milo watched the door like danger might walk through it again. And he remembered the way the boy's voice shook when he asked if the robbers would come back. And Rourke had answered no without hesitation, even though he had not known that yet. Because sometimes a promise had to be spoken before it was true, so a man could make it true after. And the bikes turned off the highway onto a cracked industrial road, where weeds pushed through concrete and rusted fences leaned like tired guards. And ahead the freight yard sat quiet under pale moonlight, with stacked containers casting long shadows and one dim lamp buzzing near a metal office shack. And the Sentinels killed their engines at the same time, letting silence swallow the sound. And Lal signaled 2 guards near the gate, and one walking a slow circle with a flashlight. And Rourke gestured simple orders with his hand, because his crew understood him without words. Dex and Lal slipping into darkness along the fence, while Boone stayed beside Rourke watching the timing, and crews waited with the bikes ready in case retreat turned necessary. And seconds stretched thin until a soft thud sounded from the shadows, followed by another. And then Lyle's low whistle cut the air, meaning clear. So Rourke and Boone moved forward quick and quiet across gravel that crunched softly under their boots and inside. The yard, the air smelled like oil and metal and something rotten underneath. And they reached the office shack, where a single light burned inside and voices murmured. And Rourke nodded at Dex, who stepped forward and opened the door fast. And the men inside barely had time to look up before they saw who stood there. And fear spread across their faces, because even criminals had heard of the Iron Sentinels. And Rourke spoke calm, asking which one of them had hit the house on Maple Street. And one man tried to act tough, saying they did not know what he meant. And Dex grabbed him by the shirt, lifting him halfway off the floor like he weighed nothing, and repeated the question in a quieter voice that somehow sounded worse. And the second man broke, first pointing at his partner and stammering that it was his idea, not theirs, not Voss's. And Boone stepped closer, studying the liar's eyes, and said that was interesting because they already knew Voss's trucks used this yard. And the room filled with thick silence, as the men realized pretending would not save them. And finally the one in Dex's grip muttered that Voss picked the targets, but did not care how the jobs went as long as money came in. And Rourke felt anger tighten his chest, but his voice stayed steady, asking where Voss would be tonight. And the man hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. And that was when it happened, the moment no one expected. Because behind Rourke a sharp click snapped through the air, and Cruz's voice spoke tight, telling them not to move. And Rourke turned slow, seeing his own club medic standing in the doorway, holding a gun with hands that were steady but eyes that were not. And Boone whispered his name in disbelief, while Dex froze mid-breath. And Cruz swallowed hard and said he was sorry, but he had no choice, because Voss had his sister, and if he did not stall the Sentinels tonight, she would disappear for good. And the words hit the room like a blast wave, because betrayal always hurt more when it wore a familiar face. And Rourke stared at him long and deep, not with rage, but with something heavier. Something like disappointment mixed with understanding. And Cruz's voice cracked as he said he never wanted this, he just needed time. And outside in the distance, engines suddenly growled to life, answering the truth of his words as headlights flared beyond the fence. And Boone cursed under his breath, realizing Voss had known they were coming, and Dex's jaw tightened ready to move, but Rourke lifted one hand, stopping him, because panic was the enemy now. And he looked back at Cruz and asked one quiet question, whether Voss promised to let her go after tonight, and Cruz's silence was answer enough. And Rourke nodded slowly like a man accepting a hard truth, and said that meant Voss was planning to bury them all either way. And the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, tires crunching gravel, fast and many. And the trapped men in the shack began to shake because they knew what happened when bosses cleaned up loose ends. And Rourke's eyes sharpened as he looked at his medic and said low that family was worth risking everything for, but trusting a snake was never how you saved one. And outside doors slammed and boots hit ground and voices barked orders, and the storm had finally arrived. The yard filled with the sound of boots and engines and doors slamming as Calder Voss's men spread out in a half circle under the cold yard lights, their shadows long and thin across the gravel, while inside the shack the air felt tight enough to crack. And Rourke stood still in the center of it all with the same calm face he wore in storms, because leaders who panic got people killed. And Cruz's hands trembled around the gun as he whispered that he never meant for it to go this far. And Rourke believed him, because fear made good men do foolish things. But belief did not change the danger closing and outside. And Boone leaned close, murmuring that they had maybe 30 seconds before the doors burst open, and Dex shifted his weight ready like a coiled spring. And Rourke's mind moved fast, laying out pieces the way Boone laid out maps, exits, angles, timing, and he realized something simple and sharp. Voss did not come talk. He came to a race, which meant the only way out alive was to move before the trap snapped shut. So Rourke spoke low to Cruz, telling him if he wanted his sister alive, he needed to trust them now, not Voss. And Cruz's eyes shook with doubt and hope fighting inside him. And outside a voice shouted for everyone inside to step out slow. And that was when Rourke made the choice that later none of them would forget. He stepped forward and gently pushed the barrel of Cruz's gun down instead of away, and said he knew where Voss kept leverage, because men like Voss always kept it close, not out of kindness, but control, and Boone caught on instantly, adding that Voss's type never risked valuable hostages far from reach. And Dex nodded, once understanding the shift, and Cruz's breathing turned ragged as he asked how they could know that for sure. And Rourke answered steady that predators trusted cages they could see, not ones they had to drive to. And something in that certainty broke the chain of fear around Cruz's chest, because he wanted it to be true, needed it to be true. So his grip loosened and the gun lowered fully. And that was enough for Rourke, who moved fast, suddenly kicking the back door open and signaling the others. And chaos burst loose as they rushed out the rear, just as the front door slammed inward and Voss's men stormed the shack, finding nothing but empty air, and gravel sprayed under boots as the sentinels cut through the shadows toward the fence where Lyle had left the gap earlier. And shots cracked behind them, sharp and loud, but wild, because darkness makes cowards shoot fast. And Dex shoved Cruz ahead of him while Boone vaulted the fence and helped pull the others through. And they hit the bikes running, because Cruz had left them ready, engines roaring to life like thunder breaking, and headlights snapped on, blinding the yard while bullets sparked against metal and dirt. And Rourke revved hard and shouted for the West Road, because Boone already knew that route twisted through tight service lanes where cars could not follow well. And the sentinels shot out of the yard in a tight line, tires biting pavement, while behind them trucks roared in pursuit. And the chase tore through empty industrial streets with wind screaming and engines howling and headlights bouncing off brick walls. And Milo's frightened face flashed again in Rourke's mind, and he leaned lower over the bars, pushing faster, because this was no longer just about revenge, it was about finishing a promise. And Boone signaled a turn down an arrow. Alley barely wide enough for handlebars, and the bikes sliced through one by one while the trucks skidded, trying to follow and lost precious seconds. And that was all the distance they needed, because Law had already planned the next move, leading them through a maze of back routes until the engine noise behind them faded into nothing. And when they finally stopped under an overpass, the sudden silence rang in their ears. And Cruz slid off his bike, shaking and whispering that his sister was kept in a small office beside Voss's private garage, a place he had been once and prayed he would never see again. And no one hesitated after that because the path was clear now. So they rode again, slower and colder straight toward the address he gave. And what followed was quick and precise, like a door snapping shut. Lal cut the power to the building from outside. Dex handled the lone guard without a word. Boone picked the lock, and Rourke found the girl exactly where he said she would be tied to. A chair, scared but unharmed. And when she saw Cruz, she cried with relief, and the sound hit every man there like sunlight after rain. And they left before sirens could arrive, because justice did not always wait for paperwork. And by dawn, Calder Voss's operation was finished not by bullets, but by truth, because Boone had gathered enough proof in the yard office files to hand straight to the one honest detective in the county. And even men like Voss could not buy their way out when evidence shouted louder than money. And 2 days later in the hospital, Milo sat up in bed, eating, pudding, while Arthur rested beside him, stronger already. And Rourke stood in the doorway with Lila at his side and the rest of the sentinels behind him, filling the hall like a quiet wall. And Milo looked at them unsure until Arthur smiled and told him those were the men who made sure bad nights did not win. And Rourke stepped closer and said simple that the house was repaired and safer now. And if the boy wanted a place to stay, Arthur had asked if he could stay there for good, like family, not charity. And Milo's eyes filled because no one had ever offered him forever before, and he nodded small but sure, and the room felt warmer than sunlight. And as the sentinels turned to leave, Lila squeezed her father's hand, asking if the world was safe again. And Rourke looked down at her, then back at the boy and the old man, and said it was safe enough for now. And outside, his brothers waited by their bikes, engines quiet, ready for whatever road came next, because storms never stopped coming, but neither did they.